Welcome to Decision Point. What do we know about the man for whom the city of Juarez, Mexico was named? Well, Nick Hauser, author of the upcoming book on Benito Juarez, is with us to illuminate the fascinating life of Benito Juarez. Welcome, Nick.
Well, thank you very much. Great to be here.
Well, we're so glad to have you, and you're involved in a lot of fascinating projects, but why this particular project on Benito Juarez?
Well, my background is mainly history, anthropology, and public health, and I came here in my 20s when I first came here. I worked with the Tewa Indians, and I've worked with them off and on ever since then. And when I started doing research, I wanted to know who the native people were. Of course, the Tewa Indians, but there were also Puros who came down with the Tewas from 1680 rebellion. But however, the original folks that were here, native people, were the Manzo and Suma Indians. So I started doing research on that. And this is how I got involved later into Benito Juarez, because when Benito Juarez came into the area here, he met the Manzo and Suma Indians.
Now, he himself was an Indian.
He was
basically.
a Zapotec,
Yeah.
Zapotec from Oaxaca, the state of Oaxaca.
And his early life was pretty difficult, right?
Yeah, he had a very difficult life. He was born in a little village called San Pablo de Galatao, about 40 miles out of Oaxaca City in the mountains. And it was a small village of mainly Zapotec Indian people, Native Americans. And he was born, and his parents were doing fine, and he was still a little child. And by the age of 2 or 3, both parents had died. And then he moved in with his grandparents, he and his sisters. But then within a couple of years, the grandparents died. So he was almost an orphan. His sisters went off to work in Oaxaca City, and he lived with his uncle who took him in. But he had to work day and every day of the week. He was out working in the fields, in his uncle's fields, and herding sheep just to keep alive, to survive. And he was very interested because his uncle had some basic education, could speak some Spanish, and he could read a little bit. And Benito Juarez wanted to read a book. He wanted to become educated. And his uncle said that he would teach him. But so he got so excited, Benito, the little boy, about 6, 7 years old, and he ran up to a tree and grabbed a switch and gave it to his uncle to ensure discipline so he could learn to read and become educated. However, they had to work in the fields every day, so that never happened. So he was very upset that he never had the opportunity to read. And then he was herding his uncle's sheep one day, and some men came up the road with wagons and what have you, and horses, and they started talking to the little boy, asking a lot of questions, confusing questions. And while they were doing that, one of the group of these men stole one of the sheep. And Benito got very upset when he found that out, that he was missing a sheep, that he decided best to leave his uncle in the village and go towards Oaxaca. He'd never been in Oaxaca City, the town, and trying to locate his sister. And that's what he did. She worked in the house of an Italian businessman by the name of Massa, Antonio Massa, from northern Italy, who had married a lady in Oaxaca and had a business there. And they welcomed him into the household. And then very soon after that, an elderly bookbinder from the Order of St. Francis, a brother of St. Francis, met the boy and was amazed at the boy's intelligence and his honesty and what have you. And so he sort of semi-adopted him, and he worked with a bookbinder, and that's how he got an education. And he started out to study the clergy, but then he got interested in law. So gradually he developed into a pretty well-educated man.
What do you think it was about him that gave him that drive to try to learn like that and to improve himself when he really didn't have much inspiration? Yeah.
Well, I think he got really interested in the possibility of changing his life, and rather than herding sheep and working in the fields and all that, to get an education and maybe do something that would help his community. Because when he got into law after studying for the clergy, but he went into law, one of the things he wanted to do would help mainly the peasants, the indigenous people in Oaxaca, which he did, and then later he became governor of Oaxaca and helped develop over 200 public schools just in the state of Oaxaca. and he got help from people in the local communities, not necessarily the wealthy, and the parish priests in a lot of small towns helped him do this. So yeah, his main interest was education and doing something that would benefit his community, his people.
Do you think that working with the religious order and the clergy of that time frame affected his compassion for people?
Oh, I'm sure it did. There's a misunderstanding about Benito Juarez. Some Catholics who are very conservative and what have you are very critical of him, and others aren't. And sometimes he's been recognized as someone who was anti-Catholic, blah blah blah, and became a Mason and all that. But he still was a Catholic and very devout, you know. But he wanted to work with people and help people. And what he wanted to do was separate church and state, because the church was pretty much allied with the wealthy land class and what have you, and he wanted to help indigenous people and peasants and what have you, and he wanted them to have access to public education.
So what was happening was that the church at the time was politically and religiously allied with the wealthy people, and he wanted to help the impoverished people, but he didn't necessarily reject the church and faith.
It was just some of the people in the clergy that were, major leaders in the church were very conservative and allied with a small class that was more or less exploiting the people there. Right. So he worked with a lot of parish priests, and what happened was he became somewhat, when he became president, it was sort of by accident. The president resigned because there was a military coup against him, and the Chief Justice, who was Benito Juarez at the time, became president. This is 1858.
By succession.
Yeah, by succession, yeah. And then what happened is, in 1862, the French, the British, and the Spanish governments sent squadrons, fleets of ships into Veracruz, demanding payment on delinquent debts that they owed those countries.
Because of the death of the president.
And because of all the turmoil in Mexico at the time, they couldn't pay their debts. And Benito Juarez asked for 2 years to how do I say it? Stabilize, and make the payments. And the military leader of the Spanish fleet, he really sided with the Republic rather than the monarch, even in Spain, and he was from Spain, of course. And he, against orders from his leaders, he had his fleet leave and go to Havana, and the British decided, well, we'll wait several years and see if this problem can be resolved. But Napoleon III, who was the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, right. He decided he became a dictator in France, and he wanted to increase his power and what have you, and he wanted to make Mexico a dependent state, rather, a puppet, a vassal. Yeah, exactly. So he put the Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian, he made him Emperor of Mexico, and that was in agreement with the top echelon in the church in Mexico and the real reactionary leaders at the time.
So that would have been very offensive.
Yeah, exactly. Then there was this. Then that followed with the invasion of Mexico by the French forces, and Maximilian was made the puppet emperor. So Benito Juarez and his government had to flee from southern Mexico all over, through Mexico City, and had to go north towards Matamoros and what have you. And finally they got to Chihuahua because the French were sending in their forces. And he was there in Chihuahua for some time with his government being threatened. And then eventually, in August of 1864, the French were coming into Chihuahua with big forces, and also with the Mexican conservatives forces. And so Benito Juarez and his government had to flee and go several hundred miles north to El Paso del Norte, which today, of course, is Ciudad Juarez.
So this was happening kind of during the time of the Civil War, and,
Yeah.
and Benito Juarez developed a relationship with Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, that's right. Benito Juarez and Lincoln never really met each other, but they communicated with each other, and they were they had a lot of self-respect. And one of the things that Benito Juarez did before the Civil War, is he allowed African American slaves, regardless of whether they were considered criminals or not, he allowed them free shelter, refuge in Mexico.
Oh.
They were welcomed.
That's interesting.
And so
he was really
yeah.
pretty progressive.
Yeah, he was pretty progressive. Yeah. And so Lincoln admired that. And when the war with Mexico, with the United States, broke out in 1846, Abraham Lincoln was then a Republican. I mean, not a Republican, but a Whig, of the Whig Party, and he voted against the war. And I think people in Mexico and Latin America admired Lincoln for his stand against slavery and the independence of Latin American countries, that there are many monuments throughout Latin America to Abraham Lincoln.
So they have communication over the issues with the French and El Paso del Norte?
Yeah, somewhat. When Juarez became aware that Lincoln had been elected president, and Lincoln was president-elect, and he was still in Springfield, Illinois, Benito Juarez had his ambassador meet Lincoln immediately to ask for support. And Lincoln hadn't even been sworn in as president, and he gave his full support to the Republic of Mexico and the people to be independent and free of any foreign power.
France or whomever, yeah. So that was a pretty big deal.
Yeah, and when Benito Juarez was in Chihuahua City, he had to flee and go north and went to Chihuahua City for several months or about a year. He heard about Lincoln's assassination and was very upset to hear that. And he sent a special letter to the U.S. government in Washington, D.C., expressing his grief and how Mexicans really were very upset to hear about that, the people, and he declared national, day of mourning and lowering the flag in Mexico, yes.
So there's a real strong connection there. Now, there became a dispute over the borders of Mexico and that kind of thing, and that sort of precipitated the whole Chamizal Park that we see today.
Okay, well, that's interesting you say that, because Benito Juarez had to flee Chihuahua City because of the French were coming in. So he and his government, got on in wagons and horses and what have you, and they fled, and he had an escort with him, a military escort of volunteers and his military people, and they went all the way as fast as they could to El Paso del Norte. And he arrived first in La Colonia de San Jose, which is on the outskirts of, then at least the outskirts of El Paso del Norte. And it was a Manzo Indian village. And when he arrived there, the people were really happy to see him. And he asked permission to go into their chapel, Catholic chapel, and for prayer, and just to be by himself for about 45 minutes or so.
So he was truly a man of prayer,
so,
and he really believed in prayer.
So they were really excited, and back in the 60s when I did research on both sides of the border with Native Americans, I met, fortunately, Manzo Indians, or at least their descendants, and they told me that their grandparents were so pleased to have him enter their village. And they opened the chapel doors, and he went in there for prayer. And then he came out, and they were just honored. And then he went into the downtown, or the central part of El Paso del Norte, of course, is where Our Lady of Guadalupe is, the first mission in the area here. Yeah. And he established his headquarters right across from the mission, really close by. So yeah, he really was concerned about the independence of his people, that they wouldn't be under the heels of the French and Maximilian, and he swore he would never cross the border in the United States at that time into what is now El Paso. It was called Franklin then. He would never cross the river until during occupation by the French, while his country, the soil in his country was occupied by foreigners, and he didn't. And the interesting thing, he was offered by the officers at Fort Bliss to come across and have a special party for him at Fort Bliss.
Why did Fort Bliss like him so much?
Well, of course, he supported. He was very sympathetic and supported Lincoln and the Union during the Civil War, and they appreciated that. And they also supported him and his cause of the independence of Mexico, the Republic. So Lincoln wanted to make sure, and then later Johnson, after Lincoln was assassinated, they wanted to support as much as they could Mexico's independence. So he said he couldn't go across the river to Fort Bliss to attend this special party to honor him. So this is in September of 1865.
So then this was kind of a symbolic stand that he took.
But the Fort Bliss officer said, well, then if you can't come over there, then we'll come over to your side of the river. So they had a big party in El Paso del Norte for him. Yeah.
Now, is he considered a controversial figure, or has history treated him well?
No, I think he's very much like in the United States, the way we look at Washington and Lincoln. He's very much admired and respected because he did defend the independence of Mexico, the right of democratic rights of the people, public schools, education, and what have you. So he's very well respected in Mexico.
Recently, an amazing thing happened where they found a portrait of him that had been missing, a portrait by Tom Lee.
Yeah,
is that
Tom
right?
Lee, and I think in 1948, President Truman at the time asked Tom Lee to consider doing a portrait of Benito Juarez, and Tom Lee very seldom did portraits of folks.
That's not what he
it wasn't his thing. Yes, and but he made an exception, and he did this beautiful portrait, which was in the Blair House in Washington D.C. That was in 1948, and then I don't know, a decade or so later, it was lost. Nobody knew what happened, if someone stole it or what happened to it. And then recently, Adair Margot, who's the head of the Tom Lee, she did an investigation to see if she could locate that lost work, the portrait, and she found it.
That is amazing.
And so it's in the State Department now in Washington D.C. Yeah.
And we have a shot of that. That's pretty remarkable detective work on your part.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. What were some of the now you are actually, your father was one of the sculptors for Mount Rushmore, so you have quite a legacy of dealing with these great historical figures.
My father was a sculptor, a painter, but primarily a sculptor, even a ceramist. And when he was young, in his 20s, he heard about Mount Rushmore, and he sent a telegram, naively sent a telegram to Gutzon Borglum, who was the sculptor of Mount Rushmore. This is right in the beginning phases of Mount Rushmore. And he said he had a background in art, the University of Oregon, blah, 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 and he would be very interested in working with Gutzon Borglum on the monument. And he was amazed because without looking at his paperwork or anything, to authenticate what he had said, he immediately, within days, got a telegram back saying, "When can you come? I want you." So then he went to Mount Rushmore and worked, and I was born in the Rapid City area because of that, my brother too. And he worked on Mount Rushmore as first assistant sculptor during the early years of Mount Rushmore. Then later he had a pottery shop there in Rapid City. But it's interesting because my father was in charge of developing the large maquettes. These are like 20 feet high or so. The so-called small-scale models for the monument. And so he really enjoyed it. And when he was working, he was, I think, in Washington, D.C. One day. They met with Congress and what have you. And a man came up to him and he said, "Here's a photograph of Abraham Lincoln. I understand you're going to put Abraham Lincoln on Mount Rushmore." He says, "This photograph belongs to my boss. He has the original negative. And we want to give you this photograph so you can use it as a reference for Mount Rushmore." So they did. It was one of the references for Lincoln head at Mount Rushmore.
Wow. So your brother, who is also a sculptor, has followed in your father's footsteps, and you're kind of working on a special project which got you involved with Benito Juarez. What's happening with that, and you're kind of carrying on the tradition there?
My brother and I grew up with our parents, and my father had a studio. And my brother, a bit older than me, began to make paintings with his father, and also got involved with sculpture, as my father taught him how to do sculpture. So he grew up with it. I didn't. My area is history, anthropology, and public health. But yeah, so, and his son is also trained by his father, John, the son being Ethan Hauser. And they're both the sculptors for not Mount Rushmore, but for the 12 Tribes Memorial of the Southwest.
The 12 Tribes
Memorial. And
which
Ethan, his son, worked on Fray Garcia when they first started the Fray Garcia de San Francisco Monument, the monument to the founder of El Paso del Norte, the Franciscan.
Right. So this is a project that was based on some of Tom Lee's work.
It was based on Tom Lee's work, who did a calendar of illustrations, 12 Tribes of the Paso of the North, and so it's based on that. And Tom Lee and my brother John were good friends, and we also with Jose Cisneros, a very good artist as well. They're very good friends. And he one day asked Tom Lee, said, "I'm thinking about doing maybe a series of sculptures representing the history of El Paso in the Southwest, and could I incorporate some of your ideas and make it the 12 Travelers, you know, but not of El Paso, but the 12 Travelers Memorial of the Southwest, so we can broaden it a bit." And Tom Lee said, "Great," and Tom Lee actually helped him, with ideas and the concept. Right. Yes,
that's neat. Now, one of your primary goals with Benito Juarez has been to get a sculpture installed in the Chamizal National Park, right?
Here's how it started. We wanted to take that concept of Tom Lee. We wanted to include women as well, which we did with Susan McGoffin, who Ethan Hauser just completed. It's at Keystone Heritage Park. It's the McGoffin Family Santa Fe Chihuahua Trail Monument. And we also wanted to include Native Americans, and Benito Juarez would be just ideal. Then I started doing historical research on Benito Juarez, and he spent 9 months at the Paso del Norte, at Paso del Norte, and he got to know the people in the area, all the various communities, including the Chamizal. The Chamizal was important because in 1862, 1864, 1865, the area, El Paso area, was hit by tremendous torrents, floods, and did tremendous damage. And the river began to move in on the Mexican bank, taking the land, and then the channel completely changed. And a lot of the people in the Chamizal who had the farmland and homes, their land was now considered by the Americans on the other side, by the gringos, as on U.S. soil. So they lost their land. So they met with Benito Juarez, and he met with them about this problem to help resolve the issue. And later, when he returned to Mexico and the French were kicked out, 1867, he sent a special document or a letter to the U.S. State Department asking to resolve the issue of the Chamizal. So he was actually in the Chamizal area.
And so it's totally appropriate for him. Now, what surprising insights have you gotten into Benito Juarez as a result of your research?
Well, I think one of the most unexpected and amazing results was I've given several talks on Benito Juarez in the El Paso area. And what's amazing is, and my background is anthropology, I have great respect for oral tradition. It's really helped a lot. Oral tradition tells you which way to go sometimes, trying to resolve a mystery, you know, sort of like being a history detective. And when I would give a talk on Benito Juarez, there'd be people in the audience during my talk or after would come up to me and say, "My grandparents knew Benito Juarez. My great-grandfather knew Benito Juarez. He met him here." And one man said, my great-grandfather was one of the escorts. He was Zapotec Indian and escorted Benito Juarez from Chihuahua City to El Paso del Norte. He said along the way, they stopped in the middle of nowhere to get food, and people were really confused, the people that weren't Native American. And there, guess what? There were all kinds of native plants out there with seeds and mesquite and what have you to eat. So it's amazing. So you just never know. I've learned a lot from people in the audience when I give a talk.
It sounds like Benito Juarez was really a man of faith and a Christian in the best sense of the word, that his passion, his intellect, his energies were devoted to bettering his people. He was a man of tremendous integrity and vision.
Yeah, and he wasn't a man of the so-called upper class. When he was here in the area near the church, within a couple blocks from the church, he got one of the major traders and what have you, and also a landowner in the area, Guadalupe Miranda, gave him his house, and for several months, and he lived in that house, and he would get up in the morning, and he would walk with no escort to his office, which was near the Guadalupe Mission. And people would see him, they wouldn't know who he was, and they would greet him, good morning, and all this. So he felt very, very comfortable with the ordinary people.
Yeah, right, Well, it's amazing to know that this man is the namesake of Ciudad Juarez.
Yes.
I think do you think that has significance? Do you think that's important?
Oh, yes.
Somehow?
Very much so, because he was here during the bleakest period of the French intervention. Actually, it was one of the worst periods was in the winter of 1865. And it was also one of the coldest winters in the area, very cold. And he was not depressed. He should have been depressed, some people might say. No, he was committed to free his people and his nation. And he was very committed to that. And
man of faith.
Yeah, a man of faith, right, exactly, and had a lot of respect from the local people.
Right. So it's amazing to know that this is the legacy of Ciudad Juarez, and there's so much more we could talk about, but unfortunately our time is up.
Okay.
Thank you for being with us.
Very much. Thank you.
Has this show filled a gap about our sister city, Juarez? Do you think that understanding the roots of a city can help us to pray more effectively for that city? Will you join me in renewed efforts to pray for Ciudad Juarez? I want to hear from you on Facebook, Twitter, or our website. Thank you for watching.